you ever watch a deal go bad before the first word gets spoken? That's what this was. A little boy, barely tall enough to reach a table, standing in a doorway that wasn't really a doorway. No lock, no hinge, just a hole cut into his whole world. And in that hole, a man shows up with somebody else's authority on his face. The kind of face that doesn't ask. The kind that already decided. The boy didn't know names the way grown folks know names. He didn't know the calendar. Didn't know what property meant, but he knew the air changed. He knew the way his grandmother's fingers tightened around his wrist like she was trying to hold time still. That woman, she was the only law he understood. Her hands told him when it was safe, when it was morning, when food was coming, when to hush, when to breathe quiet, when to sleep because the world outside didn't care if a child was tired. Her palms were rough from work, but when she touched him, it was soft in the only way that matters. Not sweet soft, not pampering soft, protective soft. You can tell a lot about a system by what it does to the hands of the people trapped inside it. That morning, before the sun had even finished getting comfortable, she wakes him like she always did, a thumb across his forehead. A whisper that didn't land in his ears so much as in his chest. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the command underneath them. Be small, be quiet, be ready. In that cabin, they didn't have glass, didn't have a door. Wind came and went like it owned the place, but she made it feel like a fortress anyway. A fragile one, sure, but it was hers. She showed him which plants could keep you alive, which birds meant you weren't alone, which smoke meant somebody was cooking and which smoke meant trouble. And she never sat him down and said, "Boy, you're enslaved." How you explain that to somebody whose whole life fits in the space between two hands? She didn't give him that word. She gave him warmth. She gave him routines. She gave him small rules that made sense. Then that man stepped into the opening and the rules changed. He didn't come like a neighbor. He came like a collector, not the master himself, not the big name. This was one of those middlemen. The kind that gets paid to do the ugly part so the boss can keep his hands clean. He looked at the child, the way butchers look at meat. Quick assessment, quiet math. Then he says it plain like he's announcing the weather. It's time. No anger, no joy, just certainty. And that's what makes it dangerous. When somebody can steal your whole life without emotion, you're not dealing with a man anymore. You're dealing with a machine. The boy's grandmother didn't scream. Not then. Not in front of him. She didn't throw herself on the ground, didn't beg. She did something worse. She let go, not all at once, not like a snap, like each finger had to be convinced, like she was bargaining with her own body. Like her hands were trying to disobey her mind. And the boy felt the shift, felt himself slide from her world into somebody else's grip. The man's arms weren't rough and soft like hers. They were just cold, functional. Like lifting a sack. The boy didn't even realize his face was wet until the man says, almost bored, "Don't start all that." That's how it goes. When you're small, you don't even get permission to feel. He reached back. Of course he did. That's instinct. That's the body saying, "No, that's mine." But the space between him and his grandmother widened anyway. And the last thing he sees, burned into him like a brand, is her standing in that opening, shrinking as he's carried away. Getting smaller, becoming less real with every step. Not gone exactly, just unreachable. He wasn't old enough to name it abandonment, but his body knew it. His body knew that love can be separated from you like a limb. They put him on a road that felt like it never ended. 7 miles on paper, they say. For a grown man, that's a walk. For a child whose whole world used to be one cabin and one set of hands, that's exile. Every step was a lesson he didn't ask for. Every step was the system telling him, "You don't decide where you go." He asked questions at first, not smart questions, not philosophical ones, simple questions. Where we going? When we coming back? Where's she at? No answers, because answers make people human, and this machine doesn't need humans, it needs obedience. By the time they reached the plantation, the boy had learned the first rule of power. Silence is also a weapon. The place wasn't one house. It was a whole operation, a living engine made of fences, buildings, and bodies. He'd never seen so many people packed together. Men, women, children, moving like they had invisible strings tied to them. Nobody looked surprised to see him. Nobody looked curious. That's what broke him in a quiet way. Back at the cabin, he was somebody. Here, he was just another piece sliding into a slot. A man with a scar across his face pointed without even looking up fully like he was directing livestock. Put him over there, with the rest. Over there. That's how they talk when they don't want to acknowledge souls. They pushed him toward the quarter buildings where other children were already learning how to survive without asking why. And you could see the difference in them. Not in size, in the eyes. These kids didn't look like kids. They looked like little old men, like the softness had been scraped out of them early. They didn't argue, didn't question. They moved when somebody told them to move. They ate fast when food showed up. They kept their bodies out of the way when grown men got angry. The boy, Frederick, though nobody treated his name like it mattered, followed them because the alternative was getting left behind. That first night, he lay down in the dark and made himself a promise he didn't know was a lie. She'll come get me. That's what children do. They build hope out of nothing because the truth is too heavy to carry. He waited for morning like morning meant mercy. But the next morning didn't bring his grandmother's cabin back. It brought the trough, not plates, not bowls, a wooden trough like you de-feed animals from. And all those children crowded around it, hands flying, elbows sharp, faces hard. Food wasn't shared here. Food was one. He hesitated just a second too long, because his brain was still living in the old world where a grandmother could split a little portion and make it feel like enough. That second cost him. A boy bigger than him shoved his head down toward the mush like it was nothing, like he'd done it 100 times. Frederick came up coughing, mush in his nose, eyes burning, stomach empty. The bigger boy didn't laugh, didn't even look proud, he just stated the rules. You daydream, you don't eat. No threat in it, just fact. Like gravity, a girl nearby, older than the rest, watched him with tired eyes. The kind of tired you only get from knowing what's coming next. And that's the thing. On the street, when a kid gets introduced to the game, there's always someone who shows him the rules, not because they care, because the rules don't change for anybody. Here, the rules were cruel and clean. You eat fast or you starve. You get strong or you get sold. And the word sold hit him like a slap he didn't see coming. He didn't fully know what it meant, but he felt it. He felt it in the way his grandmother's hands had loosened. He felt it in the way nobody was rushing to explain anything to him. He asked anyway, because he was still young enough to believe questions mattered. Sold where? The girl's voice stayed low, like she didn't want the walls to hear. Someplace you won't find your way back from. That's when he understood lucky in the sick way this world defines it. Lucky didn't mean happy. Lucky meant not dead. Lucky meant your pain came in smaller doses. Lucky meant the devil you knew. And if that wasn't enough, the plantation had layers, rankings, systems inside the system, men who supervised, men who reported to other men, people assigned to tasks like they were tools. The strongest were pushed into the fields. The skilled were shoved into workshops. The smallest, like Frederick, were put wherever they could be used without breaking expensive equipment. Sometimes they kept him closer to the main house, and at first he thought that meant safety. It didn't. It just meant the cruelty changed outfits. In the big house, nobody needed a whip to make you feel small. They could do it with smiles and games designed to embarrass you. Carry this. But the thing was too heavy. Go find that. But it didn't exist. Stand here. And if you shifted your feet, you were suddenly trouble. They tested what they could take from him without getting their own hands dirty. One day, the master's boy, old enough to know better, young enough to enjoy being wicked, pressed a coin into Frederick's palm and told him to go buy candy. A penny, like it was a gift. For a second, Frederick felt it, felt the dangerous illusion of choice. He walked that road holding that coin like it was a passport to being human. He bought the candy. He tasted sugar like a miracle. He shared a bite with another child because he still believed sharing was a normal thing to do. When he came back, the master's boy was waiting. He didn't ask kindly. He asked like a trap already set. You eat any? Frederick froze. He lied because children lie when they're cornered and they think maybe, just maybe, the lie will create a door. The boy didn't even get loud. He didn't need to. He took the candy, dropped it into the dirt, and crushed it under his shoe like he was crushing the idea behind it. Then he walked away, leaving Frederick staring at something sweet ruined for no reason except power. That was the real lesson. Not hunger, not the trough. Randomness. The fact that you could do everything right and still lose because the game wasn't built for fairness. It was built for control. And Frederick, he started doing what smart people do when they can't fight yet. He watched how grown folks moved when white men came close, how shoulders rounded, how voices lowered, how laughter turned into nervous silence. He watched which overseers punished because they were angry and which ones punished because they liked the feeling. The second kind, that's the real danger, because there's no reasoning with boredom. He also watched the women, watched how certain attention could be a death sentence. There was one woman, his blood relative and aunt, who carried herself with a beauty the plantation didn't allow her to own. And in that world, beauty wasn't protection. Beauty was a target. Frederick didn't understand all the reasons. Not yet, but he understood the results. One afternoon, he found a place above the barn where he could hide. A loft. A small pocket of space where nobody's eyes lived. Up there, he felt like he could breathe. Then he heard a scream that didn't sound like pain alone. It sounded like somebody being erased while still alive. He crawled to the edge, careful, quiet, and he saw her, tied up, exposed, helpless. An overseer stood there like he owned the moment, like this was just another chore on his list. And the whip came down, again and again. Frederick's mind didn't have words for what he was watching, but his body stored it anyway. His stomach tightened, his throat closed. He learned the real purpose of terror, not to punish one person, to educate everybody else. The woman's screams changed as the beating went on. Pain has stages. At first it's sharp and loud. Then it becomes something else. A broken sound, a sound that tells you the person is slipping away from themselves. And what frightened Frederick most wasn't even the overseer, it was the crowd. Nobody moved, nobody stopped it, nobody could. People turned their faces away and went back to work like survival demanded they pretend they didn't see. That's how a system stays standing, not just through cruelty but through forced participation. Frederick stayed in that loft long after the beating ended. His legs went numb. His hands shook. His mouth tasted like metal. When he finally climbed down, he drank water like he could rinse the image out of his head. It didn't work. That night, lying in the dark, he understood something that changed him. The cabin with his grandmother wasn't the real world. It was a small mercy inside a bigger nightmare. And the bigger nightmare had rules. Rules that said strong hands can let you go whenever they want. Rules that said love can be overruled by paperwork. Rules that said pain can be normal if enough people act like it is. He didn't have language for resistance yet, but the seed of it, quiet, stubborn, dangerous, settled into him anyway. Because some part of him looked at what he saw and thought, even without words, this isn't right. And once that thought enters you, even as a whisper, the system starts watching you different. Because now you're not just a child, you're a problem waiting to grow. And somewhere on that plantation, men with whips and clean faces were already deciding how to deal with problems before they learn how to speak. Once the system notices you thinking, it stops pretending you're harmless. Frederick didn't know that yet. He just felt the pressure change like the air before a storm. Same routines, same orders. But now there was weight behind every look, like they were measuring how much of him they'd have to break. On that plantation, childhood didn't end with a ceremony. It leaked out of you quietly, one rule at a time. Hunger became normal. Waiting became normal. Watching pain without reacting became normal. What didn't become normal was his mind. While other kids learned how to disappear, Frederick learned how to observe without being seen. He learned who punished out of habit and who punished out of pleasure. He learned when to move fast and when to freeze. He learned how silence could be armor, and that scared them even if they didn't know why, because intelligence without permission is dangerous. They moved him around like a spare tool, some days hauling water, some days running messages, Some days close to the big house where cruelty wore clean clothes and smiled. Then one day, without warning, they decided to move him again. Not down the road. Not to another building. Away. The decision wasn't explained to him. It never is. You don't explain strategy to the chess piece. He was 8 years old when they sent him to the city. Baltimore. A word that meant nothing to him yet, but it felt different the moment they said it. Like the rules might bend there, like the world might have cracks. Leaving the plantation didn't feel like freedom. It felt like being traded, like someone checked a ledger and decided he'd be more useful somewhere else. Still, he didn't cry. He'd already learned that tears didn't stop anything. The road to the city was louder, busier, people everywhere, some enslaved, some not. That part hit him sideways. Free people existed, not as stories, not as rumors. As bodies walking without fear of being grabbed. That knowledge alone was dangerous, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. The house they took him to wasn't wood and gaps. It was brick. Solid. Windows with glass that reflected your face back at you like it wanted you to recognize yourself. Hugh Auld owned the house. A man with order in his voice and control in his posture. Not loud, not theatrical. The kind of authority that doesn't raise its voice because it expects obedience automatically. But Hugh wasn't the one who changed Frederick's life. It was his wife. Sophia Auld didn't look like the women Frederick had learned to fear. She wasn't hardened yet. She still carried softness like it hadn't been taxed by power. She asked him questions, real ones. What's your name? Not boy, not you. His name, that alone made him hesitate. Names felt risky now. Names could be used against you. Still, he answered, Frederick. She repeated it like it mattered, like it belonged to him. Then she did something no one had ever done before. She offered him knowledge, not as a trick, not as a test. An offer. Would you like to learn your letters? He didn't even know how to respond. Reading was something other people did, something that lived on the other side of an invisible wall. I don't know how, he said, careful. She smiled. That's the point. And just like that, the door cracked. Not kicked open, not smashed, cracked. She sat with him, sat, not stood over him, held paper, drew shapes, said sounds. ABC. They didn't look like magic at first. They looked harmless. That's what made them lethal, because letters are weapons when they're denied. She waited for him to answer, waited like his thoughts had value. That was the real danger, not the alphabet, the permission. Frederick learned fast, too fast. Hunger sharpened his mind. Hunger always does. 3-letter words, 4-letter words. Meaning sliding into place like pieces of a puzzle he didn't know he'd been missing. He wasn't just learning symbols. He was learning that his mind could expand. And once a mind expands, you can't fold it back up. Hugh noticed. Men like him always do. The argument didn't happen in front of Frederick, but it didn't need to. Walls carry sound. Power never whispers as quietly as it thinks. You're ruining him, Hugh said, voice flat, controlled, dangerous. She tried to defend it. Tried to make it sound small, just letters. And that's when Hugh said the truth out loud. A slave who reads becomes unmanageable. That sentence landed in Frederick's chest like a verdict. He understood something in that moment that no book could teach him. Knowledge scares power more than anger ever will. Sin stopped. Sophia changed, not suddenly, gradually, like a door closing 1 inch at a time. Her eyes grew watchful, her patience thinned. Small mistakes became offenses. Silence became expectation. That's how systems protect themselves. They don't just punish the learner, they convert the teacher, but the damage was already done. Frederick had tasted meaning, and meaning is addictive, so he stole it. He watched white children in the street and challenged them to games, writing contests, spelling tricks. He traded bread for words, dirt for lessons. He learned in alleys, in corners, in places the rules forgot to guard. Every new word made him sharper, and every sharp edge made him more dangerous. He found books. Hidden ones, discarded ones. Words written by men who spoke about freedom like it was real, not a dream, a claim. He read in secret, heart-pounding, knowing that discovery wouldn't mean a scolding. It would mean punishment designed to make him forget. And that's when the city turned on him, not violently, strategically. Hugh decided Frederick was no longer safe to keep close. Too much awareness, too much friction. So they sent him back to the eastern shore. back to a man who believed in slavery like religion. Thomas Auld didn't need arguments, he didn't need logic, he needed obedience, and Frederick didn't have it anymore. The whipping started quick, not chaotic, purposeful. Each strike meant to erase Baltimore, to beat the letters out of his head, to make his mind small again. It didn't work. So Thomas escalated. He sent Frederick to a man whose reputation traveled faster than his name. Edward Covey, the breaker, the man hired not to discipline but to destroy. When Frederick heard where he was being sent, something cold settled in his gut. Not panic, recognition. This wasn't about punishment anymore. This was about erasure. And as Frederick walked toward Covey's farm, step by step, he didn't know it yet, but he was walking toward the moment that would either end him or turn him into something they could never control again. Covey didn't look like a monster. That was the first trick. No wild eyes, no roaring voice, no dramatics, just a small man with sharp focus and a farmer's patience. The kind of patience that waits for you to break on your own. People whispered his name like you whisper about storms that don't miss. This was his business, breaking boys who thought too much. Frederick arrived on New Year's Day. Fresh calendar, same hell. Covey shook his hand like he was greeting a new employee. That should have been the warning. Men who smile while taking ownership are the worst kind. The work started immediately. No easing in. No learning curve. Covey believed confusion was part of discipline. Untrained oxen. Heavy loads. Orders given once fast like mistakes were proof of guilt. When the animals panicked, and they always did, Covey appeared with the whip already in motion. No questions, no explanations, just consequence. The first beating wasn't about the work. It was about announcement. This is who owns the air you breathe now. Covey didn't rage, he calculated. He spaced the violence out like doses of poison. Morning, midday, night, never enough to kill, always enough to erase recovery. Pain became the background noise of Frederick's life, a constant hum that drowned out thought. That was the design. A tired mind can't plan, a hurting body won't rebel. Weeks passed, maybe months. Time dissolved into work and fear. The boy who read by candlelight in Baltimore started slipping away. Words faded. Sentences broke apart in his head. Covey watched everything. He had a way of showing up right when you were about to collapse, like he could smell weakness. And that's when he struck, not angry, pleased. "You getting soft," he'd say calmly as the whip fell. "I'll fix that." The sleeping quarters were barely shelter. Dirt floors, cold air. No privacy, no escape. Even sleep wasn't safe. Frederick learned to brace himself while lying still, muscles tight, waiting for footsteps. By spring, something inside him was gone, not hope. Hope implies expectation. This was deeper. He stopped imagining a future, stopped asking why. The world shrank to the next order, the next blow, the next breath. One day something snapped, not courage, not strategy, overload. He ran, no plan, no direction. Just movement away from pain. Covey chased him down like a man chasing property. On horseback, relentless, patient, Frederick hid, crawled, waited, heart beating so loud he thought the woods could hear it. For a brief moment a stranger gave him shelter, food, silence, a pause in the suffering, and then the truth. "You can't stay." Covey would find him, and if he did, someone else would pay too, so Frederick went back. That walk back was the real breaking point, not the whippings, the return, because returning meant acceptance. When Covey saw him again, he didn't strike, he smiled. That smile said everything. You learned. For weeks after that, Frederick existed like a shadow. He moved, he worked. He absorbed punishment without resistance. Covey had almost won. Almost. Then one morning, the same setup, same oxen. Same chaos. Covey raised the whip, and Frederick didn't move away. He moved forward. He grabbed Covey. Not clean, not controlled. Two bodies crashing into the dirt, they struggled, slipped, bled, neither clean, neither noble. Covey called for help. Another man stepped in. Frederick kicked him away without thinking. The fight dragged on until exhaustion decided it. Covey let go first. He never whipped Frederick again. Power, once challenged, never looks the same. Frederick lay awake that night, body aching in a new way, not broken, proven. Something had returned to him, something Covey couldn't reach. The fear was still there, the scars too, but now there was a line, and he knew he could draw it. When Frederick left Covey's farm months later, he didn't leave whole. But he left awake, and that was dangerous, because once a man learns he can resist, the system loses its favorite lie, the lie that it's unbeatable. But Frederick didn't know yet who he'd become. He only knew this. If he stayed still, he'd die, and the next move would have to be smarter. Because now they were watching him closer than ever. After Covey, the world didn't get kinder, it just got quieter. That's how you know you've crossed a line. When the violence backs off but the eyes stay on you longer. When people stop testing you and start measuring you. They sent Frederick to another man, William Freeland. Folks called him fair, like that word meant something in a crooked system. He fed people better, didn't beat them for sport, ran his place like a business instead of a battlefield. And compared to Covey, it felt like breathing again. But Frederick had learned something too sharp to forget. Better chains are still chains. Freeland gave him enough space to think. That was the mistake. Thinking had almost gotten him killed once, but now it came back stronger, more disciplined. At night, when the work stopped and the air cooled, Frederick's mind went to work. He replayed everything. Baltimore, the letters, the books, the fight. The moment Covey's authority cracked, he started seeing patterns, roots, timing. He saw how information moved faster than bodies, how rumors traveled, how free black men in the North weren't myths, they were coordinates. And then he did something reckless. He started teaching, quietly, carefully, on Sundays in stolen moments. 4 men at first, grown men, hard men, men who'd learned to survive without hope. Frederick showed them letters like they were contraband, because they were. Each word learned was an act of defiance. Each sentence was proof that their minds hadn't been repossessed. They didn't just read. They planned. They whispered about maps, about water routes, about the Chesapeake swallowing footprints better than dirt ever could. That's when Frederick made the mistake every leader makes the first time. He trusted the circle. The plan was simple, beautiful, deadly if exposed. A canoe, night travel, north by water, freedom by morning. They gathered supplies in pieces, hid them. Counted days like gamblers waiting on a final card. Frederick could taste it, that edge of the cliff feeling where fear and hope mix. Then the questions started. White men riding slow, asking casual things, looking too long. Someone talked. Someone always does. The arrests came fast. Chains, jail, silence. Frederick sat in that cell replaying every word he'd said, every face he'd trusted, wondering which one cracked, wondering if leadership was just another way to get people hurt. They didn't hang him, didn't sell him south. That was luck. The ugly kind. Instead, they shipped him back to Baltimore, again. The city felt different this time, less promise, more pressure. Hugh Auld saw value in him now, not as a boy, as a tool. So he put Frederick to work on the docks, ship caulking, skilled labor. Real money moving through his hands, money he wasn't allowed to keep. That's when Frederick made another dangerous move. He asked for his wages, not begged, asked. And Hugh, thinking he had the upper hand, agreed to a deal. Frederick could hire his own time. That's how men escape. Not by running first. By buying inches of control. On those docks, Frederick watched sailors, free black men moving through ports like ghosts with papers, names, authority that came from ink and law. He learned how freedom looked when it walked. And then he met Anna. She didn't see him as damaged goods. She saw direction. When he told her his plan, she didn't flinch. She sold what little comfort she had to fund his escape. That's trust at gunpoint. The night he dressed as a sailor, papers folded tight, heart steady on the outside and chaos inside, Frederick understood the real risk. Not capture, exposure. One wrong glance. One suspicious question. One man deciding to look closer. On the train north, the conductor took his papers. That pause, those seconds, held Frederick's entire life inside them. Then the papers came back. The train moved, but freedom didn't feel safe yet. Because even in the North, men hunted people like him. Frederick had crossed the line. Now he was free. And very much wanted back. And somewhere behind him, the system was deciding whether to let him go. Or make an example out of him. Freedom don't announce itself with trumpets. It whispers, and even then you don't trust it. Frederick stepped into New York like a man walking through enemy territory without a weapon. Every face felt like a question. Every pause felt like a calculation. He wasn't chained anymore, but he wasn't safe either. That's the trick people don't tell you about escape. The body gets free first. The fear takes longer. Slave catchers moved through the city like businessmen. Clean coats, polite voices, blood on the paperwork. A free man could become property again with one signature and a handshake. So Frederick kept moving, kept his head down. He found David Ruggles because Ruggles knew the game, knew how men disappeared, knew how to hide someone without making it look like hiding. Ruggles fed him, gave him a bed, real rest, the kind where you don't wake up bracing for impact. But even there, the warning came quick. You can't stay. New York was loud, crowded, sloppy, too many eyes, too many hunters. Safety lived further north, Massachusetts, New Bedford. That's where Frederick went next, carrying a new name and an old fear. Anna followed. When she arrived, everything sharpened. Freedom stopped being theoretical. It had a face now, a future, a responsibility. They married quietly, no permission asked, no approval needed. That alone was an act of war. Frederick took the name Douglass and buried the old one like a man cutting ties with a past that could get him killed. New Bedford didn't beat him, it starved him slow. No whips, no chains, just closed doors, jobs he couldn't get, wages that didn't match the work, freedom with conditions written in invisible ink. That kind of pressure breaks a lot of men. Frederick didn't break, he listened, he read. He found abolitionists who talked about slavery like it was a concept, not a wound. And the longer he listened, the clearer it became. They needed a voice, not theory, testimony. When they asked him to speak, he almost said no, almost stayed safe, almost stayed quiet, almost. But silence had nearly killed him once already, so he stood up. And when he spoke, the room changed, because power recognizes power. They hadn't expected clarity, they hadn't expected control. They hadn't expected a man who'd been owned to speak like he understood the whole board. And that's when the danger shifted, because now Frederick Douglass wasn't just free, he was visible, his words traveled, his name spread, his past followed close behind. And somewhere in the shadows, men who believed property should stay property started paying attention, because a man who escapes is a problem, but a man who escapes and speaks, that's a threat, and the system never ignores a threat for long. Once your voice starts moving people, somebody starts moving against you. That's the rule. Frederick learned it fast. The crowds got bigger. The rooms got quieter. Folks leaned forward when he spoke. Not because he was loud, because he was precise, because he didn't beg, he didn't rage. He laid the truth out like evidence and let it convict whoever was listening. That scared people, not the ones clapping, the ones calculating. There were whispers now, questions about where he came from, who used to own him. How a man spoke that well without formal schooling. How a former slave could sound so. In control. Some white abolitionists loved him in public and doubted him in private. They praised the story but feared the mind behind it. A sharp black man made allies nervous. A fearless one made them dangerous. Then came the suggestion. You should write it down. Frederick didn't answer right away. Speaking disappeared into air. Writing stayed. Writing left a trail. Writing gave hunters a map. He knew exactly what a book would do. It would prove his story and expose his location. It would give the movement a weapon and give slave catchers his scent. This wasn't courage versus fear anymore. This was strategy versus survival. He waited, thought, watched how men behaved when they thought they were in charge, noticed who wanted his story and who wanted to control it. Then he decided. If they were going to hunt him anyway, he'd make it worth the chase. He wrote the book, and he didn't soften it. He named names, places, methods, faces. He pulled the curtain all the way back and dared the system to argue with lived truth. When it hit the streets, it exploded. People couldn't deny it, couldn't dismiss it, couldn't pretend slavery was gentle or necessary or misunderstood. Frederick Douglass was no longer just a speaker, he was proof, and proof is dangerous. Too dangerous. Threats followed, quiet ones, polite ones, concerned advice. Warnings dressed up as care. You're too visible. You should leave. They're asking about you. As if on cue, the rumors thickened. Men seen asking questions, old names resurfacing, familiar faces sniffing around unfamiliar places. Douglass understood the message. The system had stopped debating him. It was deciding what to do about him, so he made another move. He left the country, not running, relocating. Across the ocean he spoke freely. No fugitive laws. No bounty notices. No men waiting to grab him in the night. For the first time he could breathe without calculating exits. But even there he knew the truth. Exile is safety, not victory. Back home, slavery still stood. Families still broke. Children still disappeared down roads without doors. And Frederick Douglass wasn't built to watch from a distance. So when he returned, fully aware of the risk, fully aware that he could be seized the moment he stepped wrong. It wasn't bravery, it was intent. Because now he wasn't just telling his story. He was shaping a war of ideas, and wars don't end without casualties. The question wasn't whether they'd come for him. It was how, and who would get there first. The men who wanted to silence his voice, or the movement that needed it alive. When Frederick Douglass came back, he didn't come back loud. He came back deliberate. That's the difference between a man running and a man choosing his battlefield. America had changed while he was gone, not enough to be safe, just enough to be unstable. Fugitive laws tightened. Slave catchers got bolder. And a black man with a famous face became a walking reward poster. Every step he took knowing somebody might already be behind him. So he stopped moving like a victim. He started moving like a strategist. He built his own platform, his own paper, his own voice that didn't need permission or approval. Ink became his weapon. Distribution became his shield. If they were going to come for him, they'd have to do it in the open. That made it harder, but not impossible. He spoke sharper now, less pleading, more indictment. He wasn't asking America to feel bad anymore. He was asking it to look in the mirror and explain itself, and mirrors make people violent. Enemies didn't always announce themselves as enemies. Some smiled, some shook his hand, some called him brother while quietly wondering how to control him. That's when Frederick learned the final lesson of power. The most dangerous betrayal doesn't come from the people who hate you. It comes from the ones who say they're on your side but wish you'd stay in your place. He outgrew them, and growth makes alliances fragile. He began speaking not just about slavery but about equality, citizenship, voting, power. That made even friends uncomfortable, because ending slavery was one thing. Sharing power was another. Threats followed him now like a shadow that knew his name. Letters, warnings, men showing up too close to his house, rumors of warrants, rumors of plans. Anna worried, rightfully. Every night Frederick understood that choosing to speak meant choosing risk for everyone connected to him. He could stop. He could soften. He could retreat into respectability and survive quietly. Instead, he doubled down. Because once you see the whole board, playing small feels like betrayal. He knew something most men never learn. If the system lets you live comfortably, it's because you're not threatening it. And Frederick Douglass was a threat, a living contradiction. A man they said shouldn't exist, standing up and demanding more. The question wasn't whether America would try to silence him. It was when, and whether the fire he started would burn long enough to outlive the men who wanted him gone. Because history doesn't move without resistance. And resistance always comes with a price. The only thing left undecided was who would pay it first. Power never forgives being exposed. It pretends to, smiles, shakes hands, passes laws with clean language, but underneath all that it keeps score. Frederick felt that shift before it showed itself. The invitation slowed, the tone changed, the praise got colder. Where there used to be applause, there were now polite nods. Where there used to be allies, there were concerns. That's how you know you're no longer useful, you're dangerous. He spoke anyway. Spoke against slavery, yes, but also against the lie that freedom ended once the chains fell. He talked about wages, about votes, about dignity, about the fact that a man can't be half free and call it justice. That made him harder to manage. Some abolitionists wanted him frozen in time, the escaped slave, the living exhibit, the proof that their movement was righteous. But Frederick refused to stay in the frame they built for him. He was evolving. And evolution scares movements just as much as it scares systems. Then the threats stopped being abstract. Names started appearing in letters, not threats exactly, reminders of who he used to belong to, of what the law still allowed, of how quickly a man could disappear if the right paperwork surfaced. The Fugitive Slave Act turned his body into contested territory. Legally, he could be taken, at any moment, anywhere. That kind of pressure does something to a man. It forces a choice: hide or stand taller. Frederick chose height. He spoke louder, wrote sharper, challenged presidents, not just crowds, sat across from men in power and refused to lower his eyes. They called him arrogant. They call every man arrogant who won't kneel. Behind closed doors, deals were whispered. Not all of them from enemies. Some from men who claimed to want peace, who suggested compromise, silence, delay. Now isn't the time. It's never the time when power is comfortable. Frederick saw the pattern, had lived it before. Delay is just violence with a clock, so he kept pushing. And somewhere in the country the temperature rose, states hardened, voices sharpened. The nation started choosing sides. War was coming, not metaphorical war, real war. And Frederick understood something chilling before most did. If the country broke, black people would bleed first. If the country healed wrong, they'd still lose. He stood at the edge of history again like he had so many times before. Only now the stakes weren't just his life. They were millions. And as the drums of conflict grew louder, Frederick Douglass had to decide whether to keep fighting the system from the outside or step closer to the fire and risk being consumed by it. Because once war starts, neutrality becomes another kind of betrayal. And this time, there would be no quiet exits. War doesn't ask permission. It shows up and demands everything. When the country finally split, Frederick didn't celebrate. He'd seen too much machinery to believe violence automatically brings justice. He knew wars get sold as freedom and paid for in bodies that never get remembered. Still, he leaned in. Because this time, the fire was unavoidable. He walked into the halls of power where black men weren't supposed to speak unless spoken to. Sat across from generals, politicians, presidents. Men who controlled armies but didn't understand the people they were sending to die. Frederick understood them. He told them the truth they didn't want to hear. You can't fight a war about freedom and keep black men on the sidelines. You can't talk about union and deny humanity. You can't win with half the country shackled in spirit. Some listened. Some nodded and planned nothing. Others smiled and filed his words away like they were dangerous documents. Then came the question that changed everything. Black soldiers, not laborers, not servants. Soldiers, men with guns, uniforms, and the right to fight for their own liberation. Frederick pushed it hard, too hard for some. He recruited. He spoke to free black men and escaped men alike. He told them the truth. This war would cost them either way. The only difference was whether they'd be armed when it did. That made him a target again, not just for Confederates, for Union men who believed arming black soldiers meant rewriting the social order forever, because it would. Frederick sent his own sons to fight. That's how serious he was. You don't ask other people to bleed for an idea you won't risk your own blood for, but power is petty even in war. He argued with Lincoln, pressed him, pushed him past comfort, past caution, past politics, and Lincoln listened slowly. Every inch gained came with resistance. Every speech Frederick gave was monitored. Every move watched. Every alliance tested. He knew something then that he hadn't fully faced before. If the war ended wrong, he'd be blamed. If it ended right, he'd still be inconvenient. Because men like him don't fit neatly into peacetime. And when the war finally turned, when emancipation moved from promise to paper, Frederick felt no relief. Because paper can burn. Laws can be reversed. And men who fight for justice during chaos often get discarded once order returns. He stood again at that familiar edge. The same edge he'd stood on as a child, as a fugitive, as a speaker. Only now, the whole nation was there with him. And the question wasn't whether slavery would die. It was whether freedom would survive the men who claimed they'd delivered it. Because Frederick Douglass had learned the oldest rule of power. The fight doesn't end when you win. It gets more dangerous. And somewhere beyond the smoke of war, new enemies were already preparing to decide what to do with a man who refused to disappear. Victory is where a lot of men get careless. Frederick didn't. When the war ended, the country rushed to celebrate like the work was done. Flags went up. Speeches got softer. White men congratulated each other for surviving a disaster they'd built. Frederick watched all of it with a quiet suspicion, because he knew something they didn't want to say out loud. Chains don't vanish. They change shape. Slavery was dead on paper, but power doesn't surrender, it rebrands. The whip disappeared, and in its place came contracts, patrols, laws written just vague enough to sound fair and cut just deep enough to keep control. Frederick spoke up immediately. Too immediately for some. He warned that freedom without protection was just exposure, that a vote without enforcement was theater, that black men being free in hostile territory was an invitation to violence. They called him pessimistic. They always do when you refuse to lie. He pushed for federal protection, for voting rights that actually held, for education, land, ownership, the real pillars of power. And every time he spoke, the room cooled, because the country was tired of listening to him. That's the other rule. They love your voice when it helps them win. They resent it when it asks for more. Frederick felt it in the invitations that stopped coming, the meetings where he was consulted but not followed, the praise that turned into polite dismissal. Behind the scenes, the old forces reorganized. New uniforms, new language, same intent. Men with torches instead of chains, courts instead of auction blocks. Violence that pretended to be local, accidental, unfortunate. Frederick read the reports, knew the names, knew the patterns. He'd seen this system adapt before. He stood up anyway. Older now, slower in body, sharper in mind. He spoke like a man who knew history wasn't finished with him yet, but the danger had changed. No longer a single master. Now it was an entire nation deciding whether to keep its promises. And Frederick Douglass stood in the middle of it, respected, famous, and increasingly inconvenient. Because when the noise dies down and the dust settles, the most dangerous man isn't the rebel with a gun. It's the one who remembers and refuses to let everyone else forget. Somewhere ahead, the country was about to choose what kind of future it wanted, and whether a man like Frederick Douglass would be allowed to keep reminding it of the cost. By the time Frederick got old, the country liked to talk about him in past tense. That's how power disarms you. It turns you into a memory while you're still breathing. They called him a symbol, a relic, a great man of another era. They quoted him like his words were finished doing damage. Frederick knew better, because the same instincts that took a child from a cabin were still alive, just wearing better clothes. He saw it in the laws being chipped away, in the votes disappearing, in the violence explained as order, in the way black suffering was treated like background noise again. Nothing surprised him anymore. Disappointment doesn't sting once you've learned the pattern. He kept speaking, even when his voice had to compete with younger men, louder men, men who didn't carry scars in their sentences. He didn't resent them. He understood them. Every generation fights with the tools it has. His tool was memory, and memory is dangerous because it refuses to let lies settle. When Frederick walked into rooms near the end of his life, people still stood, still listened, but there was something else in the air now. Unease, because he wasn't celebrating, he was warning. He reminded them that freedom isn't a finish line, that emancipation isn't absolution, that justice doesn't survive without pressure. He said it calmly, precisely, like a man who's already seen the ending once and doesn't want to watch it repeat. And then, one day, his voice went quiet. Frederick Douglass died a free man, but freedom didn't rest. The question he left behind wasn't poetic. It was tactical. What do you do with a truth once the man who carried it is gone? Because systems don't die when their critics do. They wait, they adjust, they look for the next generation that might forget. And somewhere right now, in a room that feels safe, with doors that don't look like doors, a child is being taught what's normal. The only thing undecided is this: will someone teach that child how to see the whole board? Or will the system get there first? Here's the part they don't put in stone. After Frederick Douglass was gone, the country didn't exhale. It recalculated. That's what power does when a witness dies. It checks what it can get away with now that the voice is quiet. They quoted him in classrooms but ignored him in courtrooms. They carved his name into history while dismantling everything he warned them to protect. That's a clean trick. Turn a man into inspiration so you don't have to obey him. But Douglass never spoke for monuments. He spoke for moments like this. Moments where the system pretends the danger is over while tightening its grip somewhere else. Moments where violence doesn't announce itself with chains but with policy, with delay, with not yet, with be patient. He understood something early that most people learn too late. Oppression doesn't need hatred to survive. It just needs amnesia. That's why his real weapon was never escape. Never the fight, never even the speeches. It was memory. He remembered the hands that raised him. He remembered the hands that let go. He remembered the men who smiled while breaking boys. He remembered how quickly comfort turns into control. And he tried, quietly, relentlessly, to pass that memory forward. Because once a people forget how power works, they start mistaking calm for justice. And calm is when the system does its best work. So the story doesn't end with Frederick Douglass standing tall, celebrated, safe. It ends with a question hanging in the air like a loaded pause. What happens when the men who see the whole board are gone? Do the next ones learn to read the room the way he did? Do they recognize authority before it announces itself? Do they spot the deal being made behind the curtain? Or does the system get comfortable again, waiting for another child? Another doorway without a door. Another moment where someone says, calmly, "It's time," and nobody stops it. Let me tell you why this story still matters. Because systems don't repeat themselves loudly. They repeat themselves clean. Different uniforms, different language, same math. A child doesn't need to be chained to be owned. A man doesn't need to be whipped to be controlled. A people don't need to be enslaved to be managed. All you need is distance and forgetting. Frederick Douglass saw that before anyone wanted to hear it. That's why they respected him and resisted him at the same time. He wasn't just talking about his past. He was pointing at their future. He understood the real threat wasn't cruelty. It was normalcy. The moment people accept injustice as routine, the game is already over. That's why his life reads less like a victory lap and more like a warning shot. Escape didn't end the fight. Fame didn't protect him. Age didn't soften the danger. Because the kind of man who understands power never stops being inconvenient. And here's the part most folks miss. Douglass didn't survive because he was the strongest. He survived because he learned when to watch, when to move, and when to speak so precisely that silence became impossible. That's Bumpy Johnson energy before Bumpy ever existed. Seeing the board, waiting for the opening, never confusing noise with control. So when you hear his name now, don't hear it like a history lesson. Hear it like a code, a reminder passed down by someone who learned early that love can be taken, bodies can be moved, and systems can smile while they crush you. And understand this. There are always men watching quietly, always deals being made before the announcement, always doors that don't look like doors until they close. The only real question is the same one it's always been. Who's paying attention, and who's about to be moved without ever seeing it coming? Here's where the story tightens. Because if you really listen to Frederick Douglass, you realize he wasn't telling you what was. He was telling you what always is. Power never storms the front door. It waits until you relax, until you trust the routine, until you stop asking who's deciding what's normal. Douglass learned that as a child, standing in a doorway with no door, watching a world make a decision about him without asking his name. And everything he became after that moment was shaped by one rule. Never let them decide in silence. That's why he watched first. That's why he learned before he fought. That's why he spoke when others begged. He knew something most people never see. The real danger isn't the overseer with the whip. It's the calm voice that says, "This is just how things work." That voice is still here. It wears suits now. It uses paperwork. It hides behind policy, timing, and patience. And it counts on one thing above all else: that you won't recognize it until it's already holding your future. Douglass didn't beat the system by overpowering it. He beat it by understanding it, by knowing when to stay quiet, when to move alone, when to make himself too visible to disappear. That's why they feared him even when they praised him. That's why they tried to freeze him in history. That's why his words still make people uncomfortable. Because men like him don't die when they stop breathing. They die when people stop paying attention. And somewhere right now a decision is being made. Not loudly, not violently, just efficiently. Someone is being moved. Someone is being boxed in. Someone is being told it's time. The only question left is the one Douglass lived with his entire life. Will you see it happening? Or will you only understand it? After the hands let go, this is where I stop talking about Frederick Douglass and start talking to you, because the man didn't survive by accident. He survived because he learned something early that most people never learn at all. Power doesn't need your consent. It only needs your inattention. Every major turn in his life happened the same way. Quiet decision. Clean justification. No warning until it was already done. A child moved from a cabin. A mind punished for waking up. A man hunted for speaking too clearly, not chaos, process. That's the part people miss. Douglass wasn't just fighting cruelty. He was fighting systems that felt reasonable to the people running them. And that's why his story never ends clean, because systems like that don't collapse in a moment. They retreat. They rebrand. They wait. The whip becomes a rule. The chain becomes a contract. The overseer becomes an administrator. And the danger becomes harder to point at. Douglass understood something else too. The moment you recognize the pattern, you become a liability. That's why he was watched. That's why he was doubted. That's why he was praised just enough to keep him contained. Because a man who sees the whole board can't be managed easily. So here's the real ending. Not a death, not a victory, not a moral, a condition. Somebody somewhere is making a decision right now that will affect lives that never get a vote. It won't sound violent. It won't look dramatic. It'll sound reasonable, necessary, efficient. And most people won't notice until the space between their hands and what they love starts widening. Frederick Douglass saw that moment coming his entire life. The only thing he couldn't decide was whether the next generation would recognize it faster than he did, or whether history would get comfortable repeating itself. One quiet decision at a time. Let me leave you with the part that doesn't feel comfortable, because comfort is how the game wins. Frederick Douglass didn't beat the system by becoming louder than it. He beat it by refusing to be confused by it. He learned early that power always introduces itself as order, as stability, as for your own good. And every time people accepted that language without question, someone paid the price quietly. That's why his life never relaxed, never settled, never softened into satisfaction. Because once you understand how control moves, peace feels temporary. Douglass didn't live like a man who thought history was over. He lived like someone who knew it was watching him back. And here's the part that should sit heavy. The system never hated him the most when he was enslaved. It hated him when he understood it, when he could explain it, when he could make other people see it. That's when he became dangerous. Not when he ran, not when he fought, not even when he escaped, when he made invisibility impossible. That's why his story still gets softened, why it gets turned into inspiration instead of instruction, why people quote him without applying him, because instruction creates action, and action threatens balance. So if this story feels less like history and more like a warning, that's because it is. Somebody is always standing in a doorway that doesn't look like a doorway yet. Somebody is always being told it's just the way things are. Somebody is always about to be moved for reasons that sound logical on paper. The only difference between then and now is whether anyone sees it in time, because once the hands let go, once the space opens, once the decision becomes official, the system never calls it violence, it calls it normal, and by the time most people realize what happened, the game has already moved on to its next piece. Here's the quiet truth Frederick Douglass lived with at the end. He didn't believe evil announced itself. He believed it scheduled meetings. By the time people recognized the danger, the paperwork was already signed, the language already agreed upon, the harm already framed as necessary. That's why he never stopped watching, even when his name carried weight, even when presidents listened, even when rooms stood silent for him. He knew respect doesn't stop removal. Only awareness does. Douglass understood that the most dangerous moment is when oppression is loud. It's when it becomes polite, when it learns how to explain itself without raising its voice. That's when people stop resisting. That's when doors close without slamming. That's when lives get redirected, not destroyed, just reshaped enough to control. He saw it happen after emancipation. He saw it happen in laws. He saw it happen in smiles that didn't reach the eyes. And he knew something most people don't want to accept. Freedom isn't a destination, it's a constant negotiation. You don't win it once. You defend it every day. Douglass died knowing the fight would outlive him, knowing the system would wait for fatigue, for distraction, for comfort, and it would come back quieter than before. That's why this story doesn't end with applause. It ends with a decision still in motion. Somewhere right now, power is being exercised calmly. A choice is being framed as inevitable. A future is being decided by people who won't feel its consequences. And the most dangerous thing in that moment is not resistance, it's silence. Because silence is how the system knows it's safe to move. And the question Frederick Douglass leaves hanging, unanswered, unresolved, is whether this time someone sees the move before the board changes forever. Here's the last move Frederick Douglass never stopped preparing for, the moment after the warning, because warnings don't matter if nobody acts on them. Douglass understood that history doesn't fall apart in explosions. It erodes, quietly, patiently. One exception at a time. One temporary measure that never gets rolled back. He knew the system's favorite trick was exhaustion, not breaking you outright, wearing you down until vigilance feels like paranoia, until speaking up feels impolite, until remembering feels like holding a grudge. That's when power moves fastest. He'd seen it as a child, seen it as a fugitive, seen it as a celebrated man they hoped would finally stay quiet, and even near the end he didn't mistake praise for safety. Because praise is often the system's way of saying, "You've done enough." Douglass never believed that. He believed the work transfers, from one voice to the next, from one set of eyes to another. He knew there would always be another child standing in a moment that feels small but is. Another decision framed as reasonable. Another line crossed so smoothly it barely registers. And he knew something else. The system doesn't fear anger, it fears clarity. Clarity is what exposes timing. Clarity is what spots the trap before it closes. Clarity is what turns a quiet decision into a visible one. That's why Douglass's real legacy isn't the speeches or the books. It's the lens. The habit of asking who benefits from this. The instinct to listen for what isn't being said. The refusal to accept normal without inspection. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. And once enough people see it at the same time, the system loses its favorite weapon, silence. So the story doesn't end here, it pauses, right before the next move. Right before the next decision that will be described as necessary, efficient, unavoidable. Somebody is about to say, there was no other way. And somewhere else, someone will either recognize the lie or let it pass. That choice, quiet, ordinary, easy to miss, is where the future actually gets decided. This is the last thing Frederick Douglass would want you to misunderstand. The system never collapses because someone exposes it once. It collapses when exposure becomes habit. He didn't believe in heroes saving the day. He believed in pressure, sustained, uncomfortable, relentless. The kind that doesn't let power relax back into old routines. That's why he never framed his life as exceptional. He framed it as instructional. He was showing you how a child learns to watch, how a mind learns to move ahead of danger, how a man survives by reading people before reading books, and how silence, chosen silence, is the most expensive mistake you can make. Douglass knew most people don't lose freedom in dramatic moments. They lose it gradually, in exchange for safety, for comfort, for the promise that someone else will handle it. That's how power prefers it. no resistance, no noise, just agreement through exhaustion. And if you're wondering where the real danger lives now, it's not in obvious villains or raised fists. It's in rooms where decisions get made quickly and explained slowly. It's in language that sounds calm while closing doors. It's in policies that don't look violent until you measure who they trap. Douglass spent his life pulling those moments into the light, not screaming, illuminating, because once people see the move loses its power. So here's where the story truly ends, not with Frederick Douglass, with you standing at the edge of a moment that doesn't feel historic yet, a choice that doesn't feel dramatic, a silence that feels easier than speaking, a decision that will be justified later, and the question he leaves behind, sharp, unfinished, dangerous, is simple. Now that you know how the game works, what are you going to do? When it's your turn to move, every game ends the same way, not with a bang, with a pause. Frederick Douglass understood that the most important moment is when the move is made. It's the second before. That breath where you can still pretend you didn't see it coming. That space where silence feels safer than resistance. That moment when doing nothing still feels like an option. That's where power lives. He spent his entire life training himself and anyone paying attention to recognize that moment. Because once it passes, once the decision becomes policy, once the door closes clean and quiet, the argument is already over. Looking back, Douglass wasn't warning about slavery alone. He was warning about human nature inside systems, about how quickly people adjust to injustice if it's introduced politely, about how often control survives because it never has to shout. That's why his voice still unsettles people, because it doesn't ask for admiration. It demands awareness. Somewhere right now, a decision is being finalized. Someone is being reduced to a line item. A future is being redirected by people who will never feel its weight. And it won't feel dramatic. It won't feel cruel. It will feel reasonable. That's the danger. Frederick Douglass saw that danger coming his entire life. From the first time hands let go to the last time he stood in a room and told powerful men the truth they didn't want to hear, he knew the system always bets on one thing: that you'll look away. So the story doesn't end with his death. It doesn't end with freedom. It doesn't end with victory. It ends right here, in the quiet, before the move, before the explanation, before the door closes without a sound. Because once it does, the only thing left to decide is whether anyone was watching. When it happened, I'm gonna leave you at the edge on purpose, because that's where Frederick Douglass lived most of his life, on the edge between knowing and acting, between seeing the move and stopping it, between comfort and consequence. He understood something brutal. Most people don't lose freedom because they're weak. They lose it because they're tired, because they think someone else will speak up, because the danger doesn't feel like danger yet. That's when systems win, not when they're cruel, when they're convincing. Douglass never waited for permission to be concerned, never waited for the perfect moment, never waited for consensus. He moved when he saw the pattern forming, not after it finished tightening. That's why he was never fully safe. That's why he was never fully celebrated. That's why he was never truly finished. Because men like him don't belong to history. They belong to moments of decision. And those moments never stop coming. Right now, somewhere, a choice is being framed as necessary. A delay is being justified. A silence is being rewarded. And someone is telling themselves, it's not that serious. That's the moment Douglass would lean forward, lower his voice, and pay attention, because that's when the real damage gets done, not after the announcement, not after the consequences, but right before, when the room is quiet, when nobody wants to be difficult, when it would be easier to let it slide. That's the last lesson, not how to escape, not how to fight, but how to see, and once you see, you don't get to unsee, which means the story isn't over, it's waiting for the next move. There's one last thing Frederick Douglass understood that doesn't get said enough. Power doesn't fear rebellion first, it fears recognition. The moment you recognize how it moves, it loses the advantage of surprise. And surprise is where most control lives, not in force, in timing. That's why Douglass was dangerous even when he was old, even when he was polite, even when he was invited instead of hunted. Because he could still read the room. He could still hear what wasn't being said, still feel when a promise was being delayed on purpose, still tell when later really meant never. He knew the system would never come at him head-on again. It would go around him, over him, past him, hoping time would finish the job. That's the long game, outlast the witnesses, soften the memory, rename the past. And once enough time passes, you don't have to argue with truth anymore. You just replace it. That's why his real enemy was never a single man or law or party. It was forgetting. Forgetting how fast a life can be reassigned. Forgetting how calm injustice sounds at the beginning. Forgetting that most damage is done by people who think they're being reasonable. Douglass spent his whole life fighting that kind of forgetting. Not with rage, with clarity. And clarity always comes with a cost, because once you see clearly, you can't hide behind confusion anymore. You can't say you didn't know. You can't claim surprise when the door closes. That's the weight he carried. And that's the weight he passed on. So if this story feels unfinished, if it feels like it stops right before something happens, that's intentional, because the most important part of the story was never his escape or his speeches or even his victories. It was the moment before, the moment when someone realizes what's happening early enough to matter. That moment is always happening somewhere, right now. And the only question Frederick Douglass ever really asked, without saying it out loud, is this: who's paying attention? Before it's too late, I'm not gonna dress this up with closure, because Frederick Douglass never believed in neat endings. He believed in vigilance. He believed that the moment people relax, the system stretches its legs. That comfort is the signal. That silence is permission. That's why his life reads like a long watch shift. Eyes open, mind sharp, always scanning for the quiet move that changes everything. He knew the most dangerous phrase in any era is, "That's just how it is." That sentence has moved more people than chains ever did. It moves responsibility away from decision makers. It numbs witnesses. It teaches people to survive instead of resist. Douglass spent his life interrupting that sentence. Every speech, every page, every uncomfortable pause he forced into polite rooms. He wasn't trying to be admired. He was trying to be impossible to ignore. And here's the part that should stick with you. The system never stopped watching him, it just stopped rushing. Because time is its favorite weapon. It waits for attention to drift, for urgency to fade, for people to confuse calm with justice. Then it moves again, quietly, cleanly. And when someone finally asks, "How did this happen?" the answer is always the same. It didn't happen all at once. It happened while nobody wanted to be difficult. Frederick Douglass knew that. That's why he never stopped speaking, even when the room got tired of listening. And that's why his story doesn't end with applause or monuments or quotes carved into stone. It ends with a tension that never resolves. Somewhere, right now, a decision is being framed as reasonable. A delay is being sold as patience. A silence is being rewarded. And the system is watching to see who notices. Because the moment nobody does, it's already time. This is where the silence gets loud, because by now you should feel it, that pressure that doesn't announce itself. That sense that something important is always being decided just out of sight. Frederick Douglass lived with that feeling his whole life. He knew the system's cleanest move was making people believe the danger had passed, that once the headlines fade and the speeches stop, the fight is over. That's when it comes back. Not as chains, not as whips, as procedures, as deadlines, as policy updates. No one reads all the way through. Douglass understood that the real battlefield isn't the street. It's the moment people stop paying attention because they think the worst is behind them. He never trusted that moment, because every time he'd heard, "It's different now," somebody ended up smaller than before. That's why he never spoke like a man satisfied with progress. He spoke like a man suspicious of it, like someone who knew improvement can be reversed faster than it's built. And that's the part that should sit with you. Somewhere right now, a room is quiet. A decision is being finalized. Someone is saying, "This won't affect most people." That sentence has teeth. And the system is listening for one thing: not protest, not outrage. Absence, because absence is agreement dressed up as peace. Frederick Douglass spent his life refusing to be absent, refusing to let the move happen unnoticed, refusing to let the door close without somebody naming it. The question he leaves behind isn't inspirational. It's tactical. When the room goes quiet, when the decision sounds reasonable, when the consequences are delayed just enough to feel distant, will you recognize the move, or will you realize too late that the hands have already let go? And the space between you and what matters is getting wider by the second. This is the last move on the board, not because the game is over, because the lesson is complete. Frederick Douglass didn't leave you a roadmap. He left you a posture, a way of standing when the room feels calm but your instincts say it shouldn't. He learned early that power rarely announces itself as threat. It introduces itself as necessity, as inevitability, as something already decided. And once enough people believe that, resistance feels rude. That's when control settles in. Douglass spent his life refusing inevitability, refusing to accept that anything built by people was beyond being challenged by people. He understood that the most dangerous sentence in any era is, "There's nothing we can do." Because that sentence doesn't describe reality, it creates it. So when he spoke, when he wrote, when he refused to sit down and be grateful, he wasn't chasing legacy. He was disrupting momentum, slowing the machine just enough for others to see its gears. That's why his story keeps circling back to the same moment. The pause, the second before a decision hardens, the breath before silence becomes consent, the instant when noticing still matters. Everything after that is cleanup. Frederick Douglass lived in that instant, from the cabin doorway to the dockyards to the halls of power, always asking the same quiet question. Who decided this and who benefits if nobody objects? That question is still dangerous, because once you ask it, you can't pretend the outcome was accidental anymore. So this is where I stop, not with resolution, not with comfort, but with awareness. Somewhere right now, a choice is being framed as reasonable. A delay is being called patience. A silence is being mistaken for peace. And the system is watching, not to see who's loud, to see who's paying attention. Because the future never gets stolen in chaos, it gets reassigned, while everyone else is looking the other way.